In this video, we're going to talk about the diagonals and the angles in quadrilaterals. We're going to start with the trapezoids. So a diagonal is simply a line that is made from one corner to another. So like so. And there's one more. So these are the two diagonals. Let's call this one D1 and D2. So there's a couple properties that you should know about them. So first of all, when you're dealing with a trapezoid, okay, it's very easy to see that D1 is not congruent to D2. And also, their intersection is not 90 degrees, so that means they're not perpendicular. So D1 and D2 are not perpendicular. And finally, the diagonals do not bisect each other, which means that this point, okay, call it M, is not in the middle, is not the midpoint of diagonal 2, and it's not the midpoint of diagonal 1. So we can also say that D1 and D2 do not bisect. So looking at the isosceles trapezoid, well, let's draw the diagonals. So there's my first diagonal. So here is D1 and D2. So it should be very easy to see that the diagonals are congruent. So that means that D1 is congruent to D2. It's also easy to see that diagonal 1 and diagonal 2 do not bisect each other. D1 and D2 do not bisect. And the last property is that the base angles, the base angles are going to be congruent. So that means that this angle is congruent to this other angle. So these are the base angles. So we can also say that base angles are congruent And finally, opposite angles are always going to be supplementary. So that means that the red and this light blue angle will always add up to be 180 degrees. Same thing with this base angle and this other blue angle on the opposite side. So we're going to say that opposite angles are supplementary. Now we're going to move on to parallelograms. So the quickest way to get all this information is to know the following. So for all these shapes in the parallelogram family, they all have these characteristics. That the diagonals, so the diagonals bisect each other. So they cut each other in half. The second one is that opposite angles are congruent. And finally, that consecutive angles, so angles that are one right after the other, consecutive angles are supplementary. So what this means is if I look at this parallelogram and draw the if I look at these two angles, so these two angles are called consecutive because they come one right after the other. So I'm guaranteed that this angle, so let's call this A, so I'm guaranteed that angle A plus angle B will give me 180. And if this is C and this is D, I'm guaranteed that angle B plus angle C will give me 180. And C plus D will give me 180. D plus A will give me 180. Okay, so let's talk about, let's draw these diagonals. So if I draw the diagonals, so we can clearly see that these diagonals are not congruent. So D1 is not congruent to D2. We can also see that they're not perpendicular. So that means that this angle and this angle are not 90 degrees. So moving on to the rectangle. So if I draw the diagonals, okay, we can see that the diagonals are definitely congruent. Okay, but the diagonals here do bisect each other, but the intersections are not 90 degrees. So we look at the rhombus. This one is different because the diagonals actually meet at a 90-degree angle. So this is 90 degrees, this is 90 degrees, this is 90 degrees. So we know that D1, so this is D1, and this is D2. So we know that D1 is perpendicular to D2. And finally, for the square, we can see that again the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. So this is D1 and this is D2. So I know that D1 is perpendicular to D2. So the easiest way to remember these properties is to understand that all of these parallelograms have the property that their diagonals bisect, the opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles are supplementary. So all you need to work which one of them meet at a 90-degree angle. So that would be the rhombus and the square.